Hello, and welcome to The Evidence Locker. I'm your host, Shay, and today we are covering Finland's most notorious unsolved crime. On June 4th, 1960, a group of teenagers were out riding mopeds around the edge of Lake Bodom, which is located in southern Finland. These teenagers, you're going to have to forgive me for my pronunciation. I have looked up the pronunciations in dictionaries and on Google, and I will try my best. The first is a couple named Melia Emenli Bjorklund and her boyfriend Niels Wilhelm Gustafsson, and a second couple named Anya Taliki Maki and her boyfriend Seppo and Tara Boisman. Melia and Anya were 15, and Seppo and Niels were 18. It was the 1960s, so this was not a concerning age gap. The girls knew each other from vocational schools, and the boys were also friends. The group decided to camp at Hockness campsite. It's a peninsula that is near the southern edge of the lake. They arrived there sometime in the afternoon, pitched their tent, and settled in for the day, which proceeded with swimming and fishing before the nighttime set in. The boys also did a bit of drinking. It was reportedly around midnight when the group decided to go to bed in their shared tent. However, we know from Melia's journal that they were not asleep for long. She wrote, quote, "Fifth day camping at Lake Bodom. Seppi and Niels were drunk, up at 2 a.m. Seppi was fishing." End quote. It's believed both boys were having issues sleeping, so they decided to do a bit of night fishing to pass the time. After a few hours, the boys returned to the tent with the girls and decided to go to bed. The next morning, the quiet, quaint evening has been replaced with pure horror. The tent is collapsed and stained with blood. Under the fabric lay two bodies. On top of the tent lays a third, Melia, naked from the waist down and horrifically disfigured. Niels is the only one still alive. He is near the tent, unconscious. He has severe head trauma and cerebral fluid leaking from his nose. It is also reported he had a gash on his cheek so deep that his teeth were able to be seen through the skin. The four teenagers were found by a man named Esko Johansson and his son, who had gone down to the lake for a swim around 11 a.m. that morning. Before going for a dip, they spotted a collapsed tent in a clearing and decided to investigate. Within 15 minutes, both of them were sprinting back to town as quickly as possible. Niels was quickly rushed to hospital, where he spent weeks recovering. He also had a suspected brain injury and therefore had some foggy memories but didn't know much of what happened. The police were able to get a few details from him with hypnosis. Once again, it was the 60s and this was a common practice. However, nowadays, this is pseudoscience at best and myth at worst. I believe that a lot of which they got from this hypnosis session is suggestive. They led him on with the answers, or it's stuff he already saw reported. The police were able to narrow down the time of the murders to between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. The short nights up this far north mean that an attacker would have a very limited window if they wanted to work in the nighttime before any early birds were out and about. And that's what happened at 6 a.m. A few bird watchers were out and about walking around the lake. They saw a collapsed tent, and they didn't think anything of it. They assumed it was simply from a party with teenagers. They did, however, see a blonde-haired man walking away from the scene. The police were able to get more detail from Niels, who gave a vague description of a man dressed in black staring at him through a hole he had slashed in the tent. Rather than entering through the entrance of the tent, the man cut the ropes, which made the tent collapse on the teenagers. He then stabbed them through the canvas material. A young man was fishing near the campsite around the time, but he did not report hearing any screams. He did, however, report seeing a blond man walking away from the campsite that morning. Other descriptives given about the man are that he was approximately 5'8" and likely in his 20s. Something else to note, the attacker had taken the wallets and keys off the teenagers. The authorities were hoping they would find someone with the missing wallets, and it would be very conclusive evidence. Police, for whatever reason, decided not to rope off the crime scene, and it was trampled on by officers, search dogs, and volunteers who came to the area to help look for clues. Because of this, in the following days, plenty of evidence was contaminated. However, despite this misstep, there were some interesting clues found. First, Neil's shoes were found approximately half a kilometer away from the tent, and with the rest of the missing belongings, they were never recovered. This is true for the murder weapons as well, which are believed to be a knife for the stab wounds and a rock for the blunt trauma. The Finnish army also conducted a search of the lake and the surrounding forests, but it appeared the killer had taken both murder weapons with him. The thing that was found, however, was near the tent. It was a pillowcase and had traces of blood and semen, but none of them could be definitively linked to the victims. It is likely that this is because a mixture of the blood of numerous people made the results inconclusive due to the primitive testing methods available in the 60s. The morgue sadly turned up no further clues, just more grim detail. Boisman had suffered severe stab wounds to the neck, and he likely died from blood inhalation. But Bjorklund had defensive wounds on her arms, and she had been stabbed approximately 15 times. It's believed some of them were after she was already dead. The officers spent the next several days searching the forest and setting up roadblocks to try and find who they believe committed the crime. They did manage to catch 88 wanted persons who had been hiding out in the woods at the time. However, none of them were believed to have committed the murders. Around 4,000 people were interviewed within the next few weeks, and of those 4,000 people, several likely candidates were identified. So, who was the mystery man seen walking away from the crime scene? Go through a list of candidates. First is Polly Kusta Luoma. I apologize if I've butchered the name. And this isn't due to looking like the suspected perpetrator. However, a dust-covered Luoma was approaching a carpenter who lived in the forest asking for a cigarette around 10 a.m. the morning after the murders. He apparently had bloodstains covering his arms and chest. However, the authorities believe he was not the perpetrator. This is because Luoma had escaped a labor facility in the woods, and it is believed the blood came from injuries he sustained during or after his escape. He also had what the police called a bulletproof alibi, so it's unlikely he was available to commit the crime. The next candidate is Pentti Soinonen. He was just 15 years old at the time and running away from his care home. No one at the time suspected him of the crime, but over the years his violent offenses racked up, and they led to a psychopathy diagnosis. Officers ended up interviewing him about the Lake Bodom murders. However, Soinonen was ruled out as a suspect. He wasn't near the campsite that night. The next suspect is Valdemar Gilstrom, and we will call him Kiosk Man, which was his local nickname. This is because he owned and operated a kiosk in the nearby town of Oita. Kiosk Man was known as something of a local jerk. This is because he was a violent alcoholic and was aggressive to his wife and kids. In addition, he was known to hate campers. For some reason, Kiosk Man did not like anyone camping in, quote, his area, and he was known to throw rocks at visitors, put razor blades in apples, and cut ropes. I don't know why, but that just seems extensive. Kiosk Man instantly stood out as a person of interest, especially to local citizens, and the authorities decided to look into him. The police ended up searching his property, however, they never found any of the missing items during their searches. Years later, however, his son-in-law maintains that he was certain they were buried in a well that Kiosk Man covered and had filled in not long after the murders. Kiosk Man's wife, however, claims he was home with her all night that night and could not have committed the murders, and police accepted this alibi and moved on. I, however, do not think that police should have quickly accepted the alibi of a woman who was routinely beaten by the suspect and likely feared retaliation from him. However, a lot of people believe the most suspicious candidate is Hans Assmann. Yes, his last name is Assmann. Hans was a 36-year-old German who lived in Espoo, which was just a few miles away from the crime scene, and he had plenty of local lore surrounding him. Hans was allegedly a prison guard at Auschwitz during World War II. However, this was merely just a rumor, and instead he had belonged to the Luftwaffe. After his death, it was even proven that he had received a full pension from them. However, he was captured and spent his last 2 years of war in a Soviet POW camp. There was a legend going around the town of Oita that during his time in the camp, he was recruited to be a spy by the KGB. While this might just seem like local gossip, there is actually some other circumstantial evidence to support this. When Hans returned to Germany after he was released in 1945, he met a Finnish woman named Vienno, who he ended up marrying. She was also a suspected spy. This is because she assumed false names when she would visit various countries, and nobody could quite understand why. More intriguing is Hans showed up to Helsinki General Hospital on June 6th, acting strangely. His clothes were stained a bright red, and his fingers were covered in dirt. Doctors were preparing to treat him for an unknown ailment when he began to pretend he was unconscious. Even more interesting, he reportedly met the suspect description to a T. A doctor that was assigned to see him was so convinced that he had found the man, he called police, who came to interrogate Hans. Strangely though, they never decided to take his blood-stained clothes for analysis. They just said that Hans had a strong alibi and that they were no longer suspicious at him. What was his alibi, you may ask? Well, Hans was staying at a motel with his mistress, and the mistress's landlord backed the story up, saying they made the two of them breakfast around 9 a.m. Hans also explained to the police that the red on his clothes was merely paint from decorating his home, not blood. However, the doctor that treated him was not convinced, and years later writes books dedicated to his belief that Hans is the Lake Bodom killer. What's even more strange is Hans came to the funeral of the 3 teenagers that died, and he had no connection to them. There's no reason for him to be there. And we know that sometimes murderers like to go to the funerals of their victims. However, after Hans was unofficially cleared as a suspect, the case went cold for 44 years. That is until March of 2004. It was at this time that Niels, the lone survivor of the incident, was brought in by police and arrested on 3 counts of murder. They were basing this arrest on the shoes that were found half a kilometer away from the campsite. On those shoes, they found the blood of the 3 other victims, but none of Niels. This suggested whoever had committed the crime would have likely been wearing the shoes at the time. This, along with some new DNA evidence that has not been disclosed, led to the police creating a new narrative in which Niels became conflicted with his friends and then decided to brutally murder all of them. After sitting in jail for almost 2 months, he was released when he was deemed not to be a flight risk. He would then have to wait over a year before getting to defend himself in court. The trial began August 4th, 2005. The prosecution's case mainly rested on the shoes. Not only was Niels' blood not on them, but the blood patterns suggested the killer was in fact wearing them. Also suggested that Niels was the blonde man the birdwatchers spotted leaving camp that morning. He went off to hide the evidence in the woods. A witness had come forward after 44 years and told of how Niels and his friend had stumbled across her camp a mile or so away from their own. The witness was a woman who was staying there, and she said she spoke to the 2 young men that night. Apparently, Niels had had too much alcohol and was trying to fight his friend. Still, that doesn't mean he would end up murdering everyone. It's alleged that later that evening, Niels then made advances on Melia, who rejected him. He wasn't happy, and this caused the other 3 teenagers to kick him out of the tent. In retaliation, he brutally murdered all 3 of them. However, Niels was a drunk teenager. It's hard to believe he could have taken on 3 other teenagers on his own. He also had his skull bashed, jaw broken, and spinal fluid leaking from his nose. Pretty severe injuries if you're going to fight on 3 other teens. The prosecution claimed the media played up Niels' injuries. However, a medical professional stated that there was no way he faked these, and they were very much real and very much severe. Also, Niels' clothing did not have any blood splatter, which should have been on it had he been the one doing the stabbing. On October 7th, 2005, the judge found Niels innocent of all charges. The jury claimed there was not enough evidence to prove the narrative that Niels, in a rage, brutally murdered his 3 friends. In most people's opinion, the kiosk man and Hans Assmann are the most likely suspects, and the kiosk man ended up confessing to the crimes to several acquaintances before he ended up killing himself by walking into Lake Bodom in 1969. However, I and a majority of podcasters believe Hans is the most likely culprit. Not only is he a suspicious person in general and was present at the funeral, he later had violent arrests, including severely beating his wife in public in 1961. He was also a suspect in the murder of a teenage girl who was killed in a hit and run, and in a case where 2 young girls were murdered camping. And when asked on his deathbed in 1997 by a journalist if he committed the crimes, he said, quote, "I will not admit nor deny things, end quote. Which I don't know if he's just trying to feed into the lore around him, but why wouldn't you deny it if you were not responsible? Sadly, it is unknown who killed the three teenagers and severely injured Niels that night in Finland. However, I personally believe Hans is the most likely suspect, but since he died and there is no known deathbed confession, we will likely never know unless DNA and forensic technology vastly improves. However, I suppose it is possible that he confessed to a relative who may reveal at their death as well. I personally believe Hans is the most likely suspect. Let me know who you think is the most likely perpetrator. Do you think it was Hans, the ex Nazi, the kiosk man, or a victim who was actually a murderer? Give us a like and a follow, and please leave a review. It really helps us keep spreading the words on cases like this. This has been The Evidence Locker, written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband Toby. Thank you for listening. Join us next week as we open another locker. Stay curious, stay safe.